We all know the protagonist is going to succeed, but I want to see how Entrapta's autism shapes her experience within the show in a fun and unique way. I am looking for the challenges that autistic people face and looking to see where Entrapta faces those in the show. In this video, going over what masking is and how Entrapta portrays that through her interactions with other characters, sensory issues, task inertia, hygiene struggles, Entrapta's lack of understanding, social contract and body language, special interests, double empathy, and also meltdowns. Everything in this video is information I gathered online, usually through government-sponsored research, YouTubers who specialize in these topics, or by interviewing close autistic people who were willing to share more scarce information and help me understand aspects that I struggled with. The copyright algorithm is claiming a lot of my Entrapta footage. Forgive me for randomly splicing in gameplay footage, but I will try to use footage when necessary.
You ever meet someone and you just instantly click?
Yes, it was like that with Emily.
If you've seen She-Ra, you'll know that Entrapta is an extremely hyper and easily excited person. Unfortunately, most neurotypical people find people who give off as much energy as her exhausting to be around. Kind of like the opposite of a sleepy dog. Entrapta is aware of this and will regularly hold her tongue, lower her voice, and withhold her enthusiasm depending on the company around her, since, as we've seen from the Princess Alliance, she will be chastised for her exuberance if she behaves as herself normally. While it's a beneficial skill to have complete control over your own demeanor and wield others' perception of you as a weapon, basically it's more difficult for them to fit in with a lot of people. Autistic and ADHD people find themselves regularly in positions where they have to alter their behavior, as if putting on a mask and pretending to have an entirely different personality and temperament, or else there will be negative societal consequences that could jeopardize their relationships and livelihood. For a lot of people, this isn't an issue because, as we're conditioned by society, some personalities can naturally absorb and adapt to the people around them to reflect behaviors. Few neurodivergent people are gifted in that way and often struggle in life as a result of it, or as we know. In She-Ra, we can see how the Princess Alliance has a general dislike towards Entrapta, presumably as a result of her social differences because they have literally no other reason to treat her worse. Mermista, Perfuma, Bo, and Adora all subtly dehumanize Entrapta for her behavioral differences, putting her on a leash, refusing to acknowledge her when she speaks. The Princess Alliance members also give Entrapta snide passive-aggressive comments, which is definitely on brand for Mermista to do, since she does the same thing towards Glimmer and Seahawk throughout the series, but where everyone seems to be annoyed that Mermista mockingly makes fun of them, everybody minds their own business when Mermista mocks Entrapta. We see in Season 1 that Entrapta recognizes this discriminatory behavior, but doesn't stand up for herself.
Harmonious teamwork with Entrapta can be a challenge.
We don't get a good explanation as to why, but I can imagine that since literally every member of the Princess Alliance is partaking in the alienation of Entrapta, except Frosta who hasn't learned better yet, that standing up for herself would end poorly. We see later in the show when Entrapta has joined the Horde, Entrapta stands up for herself against Catra, to when she wants to find the correct screwdriver, and then also, like, the season 3 finale, the side effects of that had more to do with Catra's, like, fascism desires instead of your different sorry stab you. As for Catra's interactions with Entrapta that highlight these social differences between Aulistics and Autists, Catra understands their differences and puts in an effort to understand them. To make sure Entrapta reads her loud and clear, Catra makes several displays of affection to demonstrate her appreciation and respect for Entrapta. Scorpia and Hordak do this as well. I know Hordak and Entrapta had a thing going, but Hordak literally goes from genocidal dictator to star-crossed lover, and he still found himself longing for her even after he had achieved his life's work. He didn't cast her aside for outliving her usefulness to him. In fact, it was in part his love for her that helped him to remain himself, despite the erase memory attempt by Horde Prime. As for Entrapta's relationship with Scorpia, I strongly feel as though Scorpia was written with a lot of ADHD elements, and it's really cute to see her and Entrapta bond by info dumping to each other and neither one being annoyed by it. Even though Scorpia has no way to understand the science stuff that Entrapta does, Scorpia could not be more excited for every little inch of progress that Entrapta makes in her work. Since the characters of the Horde are constantly giving Entrapta positive reinforcement for doing what comes naturally, experimenting and inventing, the only times Entrapta ever needs to mask is when Catra and gang are struggling to understand what she's doing or saying, which actually only happens a few times and almost exclusively in Season 1, which is significantly better than masking all the time. In fact, Catra even lets Entrapta know when she needs to mask for her benefit, like in the beginning of 13, where she's just gushing into her microphone about having hacked into the runestone portals because she finally got the black art so she could finally do this thing. And then Catra stops her and was like, say it again, but like a normal person. This is definitely still condescending, but where the Princess Alliance would have ignored or chastised Entrapta, Catra is being as direct as she possibly can, which I can only imagine is beneficial for the two. You be the judge of that, but I really love how Entrapta literally masks less once she joins the Horde.
Miniature cupcake? Princess Entrapta only eats tiny food.
And delicious fizzy beverages.
One thing that separates Aulistics from Autistics are sensory issues. Part of this is because the brains of autistic and ADHD people are quite literally built different, which can result in acute hearing, taste, smell, touch, or sight. Different people have this in varying strength. In fact, a lot of popular past rock stars, such as the Beatles, have been rumored to be autistic and leverage their hearing and creativity to further the musical field. I say this hypothetically. This assertion is not based on fact, which would be really hard to verify since many public figures try to hide health and mental for various reasons, in addition to basically all the Beatles being dead, so how would we even verify that? But it is funny to see news articles from over 20 years ago talk about how Einstein and Sir Isaac Newton were autistic. I bring up these examples of Albert Einstein and the Beatles to demonstrate how just because they weren't debilitated doesn't mean they didn't or couldn't have been autistic. The worst part is, we'll never know, and we probably won't know about current celebrities either for similar societal reasons. Jacksepticeye shared his diagnosis with the world. Just proof that you can be a high-functioning rock star and also be autistic. Back to sensitivities, heightened senses can often be a detriment. We often see this humorously portrayed in cartoons where there's a specific character with an enhanced sense of smell, so the villains use a stink bomb on them, or frequency weapons for the hearing folk. There are also specific smells and sensations that produce an irrationally strong like or dislike from the autist. We regularly see Entrapta feeling metal for the sake of feeling it. Although she's almost always wearing gloves, so maybe it's not that she likes the feeling of metal, or perhaps she wears gloves to protect her sensitive skin for similar reasons. This also goes hand in hand with Entrapta using her hair as her extremities to touch things before touching it with her hands, and also ties in perfectly with her mad mechanic aesthetic. It's truly an elegant way to tie sensory issues into character design, and now I can't stop thinking about characters that always wear sunglasses. Sensory issues can also go for Entrapta's food. The sensation and sound of chewing can be very unpleasant. Think of a time when you were near somebody with soup and they couldn't stop slurping it incredibly loudly, or somebody digging their fingernails against a chalkboard, or maybe you've eaten oysters only once. These are just small examples to help convey what the experience for some autistic people is like, and Entrapta may struggle with these. It's possible that she just indulges in these specific presentations of food because carbonated drinks are fun and bite-sized food is less work to eat, which saves time for more sciencing. But I feel that argument is less impactful on Entrapta's representation than the aforementioned sensory issues.
They do almost everything for me. Cleaning, filing, basic hygiene.
Since I mentioned Entrapta's gloves, this plays into hygiene issues. Wearing something 24/7 isn't particularly healthy and can result in a number of health problems. In addition to the sensory stuff I mentioned, basic hygiene can be difficult for some autistics, since rolling a bar of grease over the armpits or rubbing a bristled stick over your gums can be perceived as unpleasant. Obviously, this stuff is done for our own bodily health and to not repel the people around us with stink, so Entrapta understands the importance of such tasks. Her robots help her get through them.
I think we can safely say this experiment is a failure.
But what if it's not? No, you're right, it's a failure.
On top of that, task inertia is a more common issue faced not just by autists, but I'm sure A lot of people can relate to this. The experience of working, then you come home from work, but since your brain is still in work mode, you can come across as robotic or disingenuous to the people who are familiar with you. The inverse is also true. Difficulty taking your job seriously again after a long vacation. One solution that autistic people have found is, once they get themselves in a work mood or a specific gaming mood, fulfill the task in its entirety so they don't have to worry about struggling to exit that mental state, only to have more difficulty picking it up again later. Kind of like how a weightlifter will just hold the barbell between sets rather than put it on the floor. In practice, this can lead to very potent work output of autistic employees, since as they accelerate into their tasks, they can be completely consumed and work diligently for hours without break, whereas autistics tend to be more easily broken out of their work mode and re-enter it more easily. I don't bring this up as a, hey everybody, this is how you can squeeze what you want out of your autistic employees, but more of a, this is probably why Entrapta will work non-stop and is basically never not in the thrall of an experiment throughout the duration of the show. However, that sort of stuff often goes unnoticed by autistics, and somehow the autists manage. That isn't meant to be a slide or a joke, I just literally would never have been aware that this is a struggle if not for being told. Now that I know about it and have had it explained to me, it makes sense, and we can see elements of that struggle through Entrapta. Something a little more noticeable than hygiene is social behavior.
Are you here to watch the social experiment too?
Social experiment.
We get a very strong look at Entrapta's ignorance of social code in episodes 6 and 8, where she has no idea what questions are acceptable of her new friends Glimmer and Adora, making an offer to carve off each other's feet in response to a joke, asking inappropriate questions out of scientific curiosity, and also just generally not knowing what Adora is and accidentally dehumanizing her as a result. This branches off into a subsection of social code where autistic people can say or do things that are deemed disrespectful by the majority. But if the autist doesn't understand why they're being chastised in response for saying something, that creates an issue. When Glimmer yells at Entrapta for calling Adora an it, I believe the logic she's operating on is that the word it is a pronoun used to identify a person. That's actually the secondary definition of the word if you Google it. So Entrapta is correct in a sense, but society has decreed that referring to people as its is dehumanizing, so this is perceived as disrespectful. Most autistic people pick up on this nuance without even realizing it, so most people watching She-Ra were probably like, what the hell is wrong with Entrapta? But upon closer inspection, this is just a little bit of info about the social contract. Entrapta's accidental rudeness makes sense. Entrapta meant no disrespect, she was just curious about Adora's transformation and didn't know how to address her, so she went with the most broad word she knew to address Adora. Plus, we refer to robots as its, and Entrapta is still skeptical that Adora might be one upon seeing the sword, in addition to interacting mostly with robots, so there's ample reason for Entrapta to be saying what she said. With this social difference in mind, later when Entrapta joins the Horde, there are a handful of moments where Catra acknowledges that Entrapta is on a different wavelength and changes her attitude and language to communicate with Entrapta in a way to enable cooperation. I know this could be interpreted as Catra talking down to Entrapta, but autistic people communicate very heavily through body language, vocal tone, sarcasm, and figures of speech. All of these things Entrapta never really picked up on or took the time to learn. Think back to when Catra was attempting to interrogate Entrapta.
I don't care what it takes. I'm going to drag the rebellion's plans out of you.
Ooh, what's that?
What?
She didn't pick up on Catra's huffing and puffing displays of anger, and what does dragging information out of somebody even mean? You can't drag information, that's stupid. Why would this scrawny Neko who doesn't even know how to word be the least bit intimidating? Entrapta just acted as herself, and didn't account for her captor's body language and status. After Catra realizes that Entrapta doesn't respond to her vague threats or tonality, she takes pause and accounts for these differences in communication style to have more productive and friendlier interactions with Entrapta. This ultimately blossomed into, at this point, the most healthy relationship Entrapta has had with anyone. Everything that I've mentioned so far in this video, Nate and the writing staff wove into a fun writing prompt for all to enjoy. They made a meaningful contribution to the show, and from what I've seen, the character is positively received and so many people found her relatable and lovable. Well-earned praise. Back to sad stuff. ADHD people have a similar issue with gaining meaningful employment, an issue they share with autists. A more lifelike and frankly terrifying example of this communication issue. I don't know to what extent this assertion is true, but if customer service is an entry-level job and it's stacked against autistic people who struggle to communicate with the broader public, I can see how it would be hard for a young autistic adult joining the workforce because their unique struggle makes it more difficult to acquire fundamental job experience to move up in the world, potentially forever stunting autistic individuals in the job market.
We had no idea you were here. We thought you were still with Hordak.
People with ADHD have more potent emotional reactions to event and stimuli, so do autistic people. So, when a bad thing happens, it can feel extra soul-crushing, and when a good thing happens, it can be a very special occasion. People who suffer from PTSD also have a similar reaction, since the post-trauma stress response causes the amygdala to be hyperactive. However, I'm still questioning the extent of this assertion, since autistic children are more frequently abused and mistreated by their parents and peers. It's hard for me to think that if autistic adults have a much higher chance of developing PTSD, it taints the studies about autistics having stronger emotional responses as a result of brain circuitry. Regardless of the cause, autistic discrimination is incredibly common. I think since most autistic people don't have to worry very much about feelings, this is probably a difficult change of pace for neurotypicals who suddenly have to be much nicer than they would otherwise be. I know Entrapta is pretty unfazed by the other characters' remarks throughout the show, so I'm not sure if she's so socially unaware about what's happening or intentionally tunes it out. But regardless, we see her potent emotions reflected in her throughout the entire show. Usually she's infatuated with whatever scientific event she's observing or cause, but there was that moment on Beast Island where she shuts down as she struggles with her feelings, only to be snapped out of it with her overwhelming enthusiasm for First One's tech. This is the only example of an autistic meltdown I could think of for the show, so I hope this is truthfully representative, and I think is a nice change of pace for representing that experience. It comes across as more of a moment of abyssal depression, which I feel is a massive improvement as it demonstrates maturity, as opposed to the screaming and crying infantilizing portrayals of autistic characters in the past. In fact, that's probably why I questioned if this was supposed to represent an autistic meltdown at first, because it's so subtle compared to what people are used to seeing.
You're asking me about my theories? I've waited years for someone to ask me about my theories!
Moving away from the sad stuff, Entrapta likes technology, which I guess includes trains, but there aren't really trains on Etheria. Something within Entrapta irrationally compels her to try learning everything there is to know about First One's technology and robotics. This compulsion would be referred to as a special interest. I have yet to find anything that does a good job explaining why this is an occurrence for autistic folk, but the closest demonstration I found is autistic people's brains aren't wired for social interaction the way autistic people are. Instead, they are wired for all the other stuff that we commonly associate autistic people to be obsessed with, like Sonic the Hedgehog, planes, and Warhammer figurines. I didn't find any information on why autistic people attach to these things, but it makes sense that devoted autistic inventors would be at the forefront of societal progress and thus maintaining status in the gene pool, like Albert Einstein, Isaac Newton, and let's go back to my Rockstar example. I know what I just said sounds a little bit like I'm about to discuss eugenics. I'm not. I enjoy looking at the evolutionary history of abstract concepts like religion, racism, and autism, and how they can take on a life of their own within a society and evolve in tandem with the civilizations they impose on. For example, most religions we have surviving today are ones that have religious texts about enslaving other nations who refuse to abide by their religious doctrine. Since religions that didn't preach conquest were overtaken, like a sheep that doesn't know to run from the wolves. A prehistoric autistic hunter may have had more sensitive eyes and a special interest in hunting, resulting in an esteemed tribe member that was able to procreate more autistic children. Again, I'm not advocating to select gene types for procreation. This is not a discussion about eugenics. I'm just hypothesizing about how autistic people came to be because I'm interested in how things happen. This is just a potential example as to why people are the way they are.
Hit a few bumps, but it was not a total failure. I made some important discoveries.
A diagnosis is just a formal medical recognition that a person is a particular way. Much the same way that people know they're sick. It's obvious that somebody has the flu, but since being sick can also be faked, your boss would like an official diagnosis to verify your condition in order to grant you time off. Unfortunately, people cannot afford healthcare to verify their autistic status, as it takes longer to diagnose than a simple flu analysis. The patient simply knows they are different and try to adjust their own life accordingly with or without a diagnosis. Many people who are diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder at a young age know this as an element of themselves because they had a disability which brought them into the medical system at a young age. On the journey through the medical system, where people are trained to understand what's happening with the body and mind, it will usually be discovered that this patient is autistic as doctors try to learn the extent of this person's disabilities and just generally things about them. Because of this, autistic people who are not conventionally disabled go undiagnosed, while only disabled autists receive acknowledgement from the medical system. Over the last decade, scientists are starting to confront how their prior beliefs of autism as a disability were incorrect. As more and more autistic people are diagnosed, the lower the percentage is that autistic people are disabled. This is similar to cancer and various other fatal illnesses. As a civilization, we are living longer lives than we've ever had before, yet we have higher rates of cancer and heart disease than ever before. The only reason that a graph would portray us as more ill than past generations is only because people are actually paying their doctors a visit and trying to catch these fatal issues before the conclusion. In the past, people would keel over dead and nobody really knew why, but nowadays we can catch cancers and heart attacks as they're happening and save lives. The same is also true for age. If we are living 3 times longer than we did 500 years ago, that should hypothetically mean that we are 3 times as likely to get cancer, but that's not how the body works, which is why just because one graph goes up or down over time doesn't mean there's a problem. It might just be the way of things. In our current era, we understand our medical practices a little better and are learning a more beneficial way to interface with it. We've had clerics, shamans, and witch doctors as common practitioners when America was founded. Nowadays, we have individuals with distilled knowledge of the human body and mind, using that distilled knowledge to revise old science for mistakes, false assertions, and toss out irrelevant studies. As we learn more and more about what autism is, our standards for how we judge autistic portrayal in media will change as well.
Science!
I'm going to need you to try again, but this time talk like a normal person.
Autistic people value their time. Autistic people value knowledge. Thomas Jefferson was a very curious person who was shy and awkward, hated appearing in public, gained a reputation of his shyness and being eccentric, loved to be solitary and with a tendency to mumble, spent up to 10 hours each day at his writing desk, would often hold private dinner parties for guests and cabinet members to discuss philosophy and science, also believed to have undiagnosed autism, would quote, "Knowledge is power." Meanwhile, Benjamin Franklin was the one who said time is money. Autistic people explain concepts in detail as a show of respect for the person they are communicating with. Meanwhile, autistic people try to summarize their information to preserve each other's time. This is a rudimentary summary of what double empathy looks like. Autistic people have likely experienced a situation like this, where an autistic person info dumps about something they loved with the other person in an attempt to bond. Meanwhile, the autistic person is incredibly annoyed by this display, or an autistic doesn't explain a joke that they just said to an autist and dismiss it with a never mind or the like. Not because they don't want people to participate in the fun, but more so they would feel bad about wasting the other person's time explaining the joke. Entrapta is so excited by Catra allowing her to info dump about the planetary runestone connections at the end of season 1 that it gives her a big uptick in Entrapta's friendship chart, which we see later in season 3. We see throughout the show that Scorpia has a similar issue. She info dumps to random strangers at times, also to Catra. We see later on in the show that Catra has actually had off-screen conversations about these info dump sessions, particularly not to talk to her about them when she's busy with both Entrapta and Scorpia. I feel like this implies that Catra gives them both a genuine listen now and then, especially since throughout seasons 2 and 3, the characters seem to progress progressively have a much stronger bond and intuition about each other across episodes, which also plays into the season 3 finale betrayal. There is one moment where Entrapta betrays this sentiment in exchange for a joke in season 1 when she's like,
And used math. Wait, do I have to explain math to you?
This moment goes against the double empathy dilemma, but since Entrapta is masking during this moment because Catra doesn't really understand what she's talking about, and so Entrapta masks to be like, okay, I'm talking to an autistic. What do autistic people sound like? It's also reasonable that Entrapta had to factor in time and, rather than weigh the reaction, simply outright ask if Catra would like a deeper explanation or not. Entrapta is also a globally renowned scientist, and despite Catra's influence, it's not like Entrapta would know the extent of Catra's mathematical skill, nor if Catra needs to know the formulas she's using. At a second glance, I think this response is rather reasonable. If you like the video, give me a subscribe and a like for more She-Ra or Audi content. Make sure you see my other Entrapta video if you haven't already. It's titled How Entrapta Became Subjective. I'll see you later. Peace.